In 1980, Enrique Camarena was the lead investigator in the largest drug bust that had happened in Mexico. This resulted in the arrest of a few cartel members, but what they did to him next changed the course of his life forever. Here are 5 times people snitched on the wrong cartel. Whitey Bulger. December 23, 1994. Well-known gang leader Whitey Bulger went into hiding after his FBI handler, John Connolly, tipped him off about a pending RICO indictment against him, and he remained at large for about 16 years. Now, what could have led one of the most popular organized crime bosses who led the Winter Hill Gang go into hiding? And why did he have an FBI handler? This is where the story becomes interesting. Whitey developed a bad reputation growing up as a thief and a street fighter in South Boston. That led him to meet more criminals. In 1943, he was arrested at the age of 14, where he was charged with theft, serving about 5 years in juvenile jail. Shortly after his release in April 1948, Bulger joined the Air Force, but this didn't mean he had turned a new leaf. He spent time in military prison for several assaults. He would eventually get discharged from service and return to his hometown of South Boston, where he became an FBI informant and helped the government take down many members of his rival crime family. For Bulger, there were only 2 options: align with his gang or get snitched on. However, when he got tipped off that the FBI was turning on him, he exiled himself for 16 long years. And for 12 of those years, he was on the FBI's most wanted list, right under Osama bin Laden. In the summer of 1983, tension between him and the FBI grew more and more. It all started when an employee of Coinomatic, a cash laundering vending machine company owned by the Patriarchus, was kidnapped on the job. Operating on a tip, the Boston Police Department raided a butcher shop that was co-owned by Bulger and 2 other Winter Hill members, where they found the employee who was suspected to be a member of the rival gang Patriarcha, hanging from a beef rack. He had already been tortured and held captive for more than 6 days. The discovery triggered a string of killings by Patriarcha's members as some form of retribution. In the next few months, 3 Winter Hill members were executed. This mob war shone a large spotlight on Bulger's handler, John Connolly, and triggered an internal investigation within the FBI. Whitey was eventually captured on October 2011, and he was sentenced to 2 consecutive sentences. Not only was he charged with racketeering and extortion, but he was also charged with his involvement in 11 murders. Since then, he spent his time incarcerated in the state of Florida, where he thought he would live out the rest of his life, free from any sort of gang violence or retribution. However, after some time, he was transferred to West Virginia, and just the day after his arrival, he wound up dead. His death was very brutal. 4 inmates somehow picked the lock of his cell as early as 6 a.m. and beat him with a sock loaded with metal locks. This would be a classic snitch murder, as the eyes and tongues are always removed from a snitch. Throughout his time as a federal informant, he snitched on way too many people. And those people didn't forget. His case proves that snitches can forget stitches. They end up dead. Frederick Jerome Kobia. October 2009. Frederick was arrested for the gruesome murder of 57-year-old Desmond Dunkley at a South Bay home. According to reports, he pled guilty to second-degree murder and home invasion charges, but his sentencing was delayed because he served as an informant in nearly 24 cases. When it comes to ratting out a few fellow inmates, Frederick Jerome Kobia is miles ahead of anyone. This convicted murderer single-handedly provided the authorities with more information than any other criminal, but he soon learned that being a snitch doesn't always pay off. He planned to snitch on as many people as he could, hoping the feds could help him through witness protection, and wouldn't have to face any kind of prison time or the streets ever again. In hopes of sparing Kobia from a death sentence or even life imprisonment, his attorney called numerous veteran county homicide prosecutors and top sheriff's detectives to testify in the criminal's defense. Many of them would describe his help to the authorities as extraordinary, and would even testify that not only did he help them put dangerous men behind bars, but also saved a deputy's life by uncovering a jailhouse plot against her. This guy was actually one of their favorite snitches, and they really tried to keep him out of prison. Now, the judge, Joseph Marks, looked completely shocked at what was happening in the courtroom. The prosecutors had completely switched sides and were almost doing a better job at defending Kobia than his own defense attorney. The judge said, "I've not encountered this in my 30 years of practicing law. While he acknowledged the support Kobia received from law enforcement officials, the judge couldn't just ignore his long criminal record of violent crimes or the vicious way he killed Dunkley. First, he tied him to a chair and began to hit him viciously in the face with the butt of a pistol, and after that he shot him twice for good measure, and then fled with the pot he had stolen. The judge rejected defense attorney Valeria's request for a 10-year sentence, which would have meant he'd be allowed to go free because he'd served 10 years in the county jail, while he made good on his promise to testify against other inmates. And instead, at 47 years old, he'd be given 40 years behind bars, which means Kobia could possibly be well over 70 before his release. The Flores Twins. November 2008. Pedro and Margarito Flores, better yet known as the Flores Twins, were arrested by the DEA in Chicago as part of a major drug bust. And immediately after that arrest, they were faced with the daunting choice of snitching or spending the rest of their lives in prison. Now, the Flores Twins didn't just snitch on anybody. They snitched on the godfather of the drug world, El Chapo. According to the twins, they were only 7 years old when they started helping out their dad on their little drug runs. They would learn a lot about the drug trade and about crossing the border, what routes to take, and how to move without attracting too much attention. The brothers revealed in a podcast that by the age of 17, they were already in the cocaine trade and were sitting on just over $1 million in profits. They rose to power through deception and determination, working their way up the ranks of the drug world, even becoming trusted confidants of the infamous El Chapo, before they decided to turn against him and become informants for the U.S. government. Their arrest was a result of a lengthy investigation into the twins' drug trafficking activities, which included the importation and distribution of large quantities of cocaine and heroin from Mexico. Now, the twins had become one of the most prominent distributors for the Sinaloa cartel. Since their introduction into the business, they were practically in charge of the spread of cocaine into the streets of Chicago, Columbus, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, New York, and Washington, which facilitated the cartel's permeation into the streets of America, and they quickly became the leading distributors of the US of A. September 2005, this was the moment they began making remarkable sales. And according to the twins, this wouldn't have been possible if they hadn't met up with Sinaloa's own El Chapo in 2005. They struck a deal that allowed the twins to receive large shipments of cocaine and heroin on credit, since they didn't have much money to begin with. They would get the drugs at the frontier and transport them to Chicago, which served as their HQ. After that, a team of workers unloaded and packaged contents and distributed them to various barrios, but their alliance seemed to end after the arrest of the twins. The fear of spending the rest of their lives in prison was enough to convince them to ultimately choose to cooperate willingly, providing valuable information to the DEA about the inner workings of the Sinaloa cartel and its leader, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Their cooperation proved to be instrumental in the eventual capture and imprisonment of El Chapo, who had for what seemed like forever been considered one of the most elusive and dangerous drug lords in the world. However, their decision to become informants would come with a heavy price, despite assurances from the U.S. government that they would be protected. The Flores twins would forever be targeted by members of the cartel who saw them as traitors. But their snitching sort of paid off, because rather than getting a life sentence, they were given only 14 years. The judge's final address hit the twins with a dose of reality when he said, "I'm not going to leave you in prison for life. In reality, you already have a life sentence. You and your families, for the rest of your lives, are going to have to look over your shoulders, and you're going to be asking if the vehicle or motorbike that is at your side is coming for you. You'll ask if some of them are coming to kill you. And every moment when you start your car, you'll be wondering if it'll explode, and this will be the rest of your lives." And that just perfectly explains the situation of the twins now. They can't go back to their native town, and they've gone into hiding, because you know they've been issued multiple death threats by the Sinaloa cartel. Renee Enriquez. October 1989, California-born Mexican mafia leader Renee Enriquez was arrested and charged with the murder of Cynthia Galvadon. But rather than facing the death penalty, he was given life in prison because he pled guilty to the offense. This didn't change who he was, though. He was still a stone-hearted killer even while in prison. July 1991, Enriquez and another man assaulted another Mexican mafia leader, Salvador Monbuenrostro, at a lawyer's interview room in the LA County Jail. They stabbed this guy 30 times, but luckily for Salvador, he survived. This led him to being transferred to the Pelican Bay County Jail in 1993. And because he was still a member of a gang, he was locked in a lonely, windowless isolation cell in the security housing unit. July 2003, Enriquez formally declared his defection from the Mexican mafia and provided the American government with crucial information on criminals he'd also been working with. He took that snitching up a notch and showed up to a dozen of trials and conferences as a key witness. The reason for this isn't far-fetched, though. He saw snitching as a literal get-out-of-jail card. In 2014, officials from at least 11 different federal and state law enforcement agencies wrote letters to the State Parole Board, attesting to his contributions in assuring that criminals were caught and properly punished. In February 2015, he appealed for parole and promised the parole board that, if released, he would enter into the federal government's witness protection program, because he was on the Mexican Mafia's hit list for more than a decade after his 2003 cooperation with law enforcement. But he also added that he would not appear as a registered sex offender, and he would be under the stringent supervision of the U.S. Marshal Service. This request, however, was not granted, as the then governor of California, Jerry Brown, blocked his release, writing, "Because he's a high-profile dropout targeted by the Mexican Mafia, Mr. Enriquez's parole poses a serious security risk to him, his family, his parole agents, and the community in which he's placed." November 2017, California Governor Jerry Brown once again denied Enriquez's parole, citing that same reason as before. This time Enriquez seemed a lot more remorseful, and he said, "I cannot undo the past, but I can contribute to the future." This wasn't the last time he'd appeal, and it would get blocked. But after being denied 2 more times in 2017 and 19, he was finally granted parole in July 2022, where he was finally assimilated into the federal government witness protection program. Enrique Camarena. February 7, 1985. 4 cars filled with armed men were stationed just outside the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara, Mexico, waiting for Camarena. And the moment he stepped out of that consulate, they sprung into action. The men, who were a part of Mexico's most vicious drug cartel, bundled him into one of their cars in broad daylight, and that was the last anyone saw him. But this was more than just a case of kidnapping. It was revenge. July 1947, Kiki was born in Mexico to a middle-class family, and when he was about 9, they moved to California. But this move led him to fall into poverty. That didn't stop him, though. He graduated high school in 1966 and joined the Marines until 1970, when he was honorably discharged. After a while, he would begin working for the Imperial County Narcotics as an undercover agent, but the war against drugs was becoming more fierce at that time. A huge network known as the French Connection smuggled heroin from Indochina and Cuba, through Turkey and France, and then into the U.S. In the 60s, the U.S. government was finally able to cripple him. But like most drug-related crimes, crippling one only meant some other cartel could thrive. Now the U.S. had to deal with the enemy in the South. The flow of drugs from Mexico had always been a source of concern for the U.S., and it caused a huge rift between the two governments. 1973, the U.S. decided to wage war on drugs, so they created the DEA, and with that they needed Spanish-English-speaking agents. So Kiki was hired as a special agent in 1974. In 1980, the DEA established a resident office in Guadalajara, and Kiki was immediately assigned there because there was an explosion in drug trafficking. He would speak to his wife about this, and the city's favorable exchange rate coupled with the weather convinced her that this was the best decision for the family, and they had no idea that their lives would soon take a very dark turn. Miguel Gallardo owned the Guadalajara cartel, nicknamed the Godfather for how he united Mexico's drug kingpins like never before. So breaking the cartel's backbone was Kiki's primary objective. 1994. Kiki got a tip from an informant working in a large marijuana plantation in a remote village called Toronto Buffalo. He immediately reported to his supervisor, who in turn asked the Mexican government to provide aerial photos of that location, but the images provided didn't show any plantation. Eventually, they found out that those were old photos, so Kiki and Alfredo, his pilot friend, decided to fly over the ranch and take new pictures. They confirmed the existence of a mega field that was more than 2,500 acres, producing more than $8 billion worth of product yearly. 450 soldiers were sent there to burn it, but the whole operation just seemed a little fishy. It looked like the Mexican government had informed the owners of the ranch beforehand, because when authorities got there, the entire factory was a ghost town. That was the biggest bust made by the DEA. And while that was great news for the USA, it kinda made the drug lords anxious. And there was an air of suspicion around the city. It became increasingly dangerous for Americans to move around. The killing of innocent Americans continued though, but there was only one man they were truly after. February 7th, 1985, after a long search, a source finally blew Kiki's cover and exposed the fact that he was in charge of the Toronto Buffalo bust. And finally, the drug lords had a target. Quintero ordered the kidnapping of the agent with the help of some corrupt officers from the Mexican intelligence agency. As he stepped out of the U.S. consulate to meet with his wife for lunch at their usual spot, a man flashed his DFS badge, telling Kiki that the higher-ups wanted to have a meeting with him. To his surprise, a lot of other men surrounded him and forced him into the back seat of one of their vehicles, and then took him to a safe house where he was tortured and interrogated. His autopsy showed that he'd been ruthlessly beaten and burned, with his spine broken. They also kidnapped and tortured his pilot friend, Captain Alfredo, from the airport because of his involvement in the raid. Eventually, Kiki succumbed to his injuries, and he was wrapped along with Alfredo, who was still alive, in plastic, and they were both buried.